Hello, I'm Professor Joseph Luzzi. I teach comparative literature at Bard College, and I'm very excited to be here today to talk about our theme, which is why Homer matters, reading the Iliad and the Odyssey today. I want to emphasize that final word today because obviously these are two of the most, storied literary works in the Western tradition, right? The Iliad and the Odyssey. One could argue that they're the de facto beginning of the Western literary tradition, right? There certainly were works written earlier, but in terms of the best known, the starting point, the genealogy in the sense of going backwards to that point of origin, almost a family tree of literature. The names, the Iliad and the Odyssey really ring out, right? But I think because of that, sometimes people can feel a little daunted by them. There may be the fear of being back in the college classroom and having to, give a report on the mythology of the Iliad or the Odyssey. Comes to mind. That's why I choose that word today, because I believe they are very relevant today, and I hope to show you why. So let's dig in, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards. So when we think of the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer, the person that wrote them, I have to put actually Homer in quotes because you'll see why a little bit later. But let's focus on the Iliad and the Odyssey. And a way I always love to begin my discussion of these two texts is I say, good enough for Leo Tolstoy, right? The great Russian author, the author of Anna Karenina, War and Peace, and so many other works. Tolstoy, when he had written War and Peace, which is one of the most famous and acclaimed of all historical novels, about the Napoleon during the 19th century in this sort of sprawling tome. Apparently, the story has it that he read Homer's Iliad and said, "Never again will I write such wordy trash as what I've written," right? Because he was so blown away by the power and the force of the Iliad that he felt his own work just paled in comparison. So, I love this story because if it makes Tolstoy feel bad about his writing, how are the rest of us supposed to feel? But I think it gives you a sense of just how three things. One, just how central the Iliad and the Odyssey were in the Western canon and remain so for centuries, right? We teach him every year in college seminars. Tolstoy in the 19th century was reading him. In the Renaissance, people were reading either these works in the original Greek or more often and more likely in, say, a Latin translation. For example, Dante never read Homer in the original, but there were so many adaptations of it, and there were so many sort of retellings in languages that he did read that he was able to access the story. So good enough for Leo Tolstoy, I think good enough for us at One Day U. And the other thing I think about that is so important is we don't really know who Homer is or was. When I say is, I mean, obviously the figure Homer died long ago, but who was he? It's a real mystery. Now, you would have to be a philologist, a professor of ancient Greek, literature, which I am not, to really, some people devote their lives to exploring the legend of Homer, uncovering the identity of Homer. And, and it's still not really conclusive. So we certainly can't do that in a 1-hour presentation. But I will tell you this, there are great controversies about Homer. Some people put Homer in quote marks because the understanding is we don't really know. We don't have the original autograph version of the Odyssey or the Iliad that promise us is that Homer wrote both of these works. And it's a much more complicated issue than say, we don't have the original of Dante's Divine Comedy, but we know that he wrote it. And through existing manuscripts, we can piece together what the original of Dante likely looked like. The same with Virgil's Aeneid, right? Virgil was clearly the author of that Latin epic poem. It's a little more, it's actually much more complicated than Homer because he's often a legendary figure, right? Notice that the eyes here. He's known as the blind bard, right? He's blind. He supposedly was a beggar who wandered throughout the Greek countryside. You see him here, not, being unable to see, being led by youth, kind of dressed in impoverishedly, this sense that he was this marginal figure, the storyteller, right? Who was he? And as I said, the Greek tradition is filled with legends about Homer, and it remains an open question. In fact, one philologist, the great Italian philosopher of history, Giambattista Vico, actually compared the Iliad and the Odyssey and said, if you read them together, you'll see that, the Odyssey, not only is it much different in tone, and that's true. The Iliad is the story of the war for Troy, right? The Odyssey is the story of the homecoming of the king, Odysseus, going back to Ithaca. And they're very different, right? They're very different in tone. The Iliad has this kind of electric charge running through it, whereas the Odyssey has a kind of more autumnal, melancholic feel to it of the returning hero. So, but beyond those, Vico says, if you compare references culturally, they refer to practices that are centuries apart. His argument is that they couldn't have been written by the same person. Again, this is such a complicated question. Here's what we have to know. Ultimately, my question is, does it matter, right? We assign these texts to the name Homer. Does it matter? Because we do have versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey now that have been reconstructed, that have stood the test of time. So we have a somewhat stable text of it, right? A. B, the real author of these texts, in a way, was the Greek people. Why? Because they were transmitted orally. This is so important. This is one of the most important things I'm going to tell you today in our conversation. The Iliad and the Odyssey were not read in the beginning, the way I could stay here, right here with this paper and read in silence. No, they were narrated the way we read to children at night, the way we consume folk tales, fairy tales, fables, right? Oral transmission. Think of the people of Greece as having preserved these stories and passed them on from one generation to the next. Isn't that a miracle? And how do you get proof of that? Well, there's all these stock phrases in them. For example, even when Achilles is sitting down, he's referred to as swift-footed Achilles. Does it really matter that he's swift-footed when he's sitting down? Or they all have their sort of tagline, like oxen-eyed Hera, which is a compliment to her beauty, right? By the norms of the day, or gray-eyed Athena, right? Or, they all have these things, rosy-fingered Dawn. These were mnemonic devices that were meant to aid the storyteller in recounting the tale. So this is the thing we have to remember. The word Homer, the name Homer, is also a code for the transmission of the Iliad and the Odyssey from one generation to the next by the people of Greece, by the ancient Greek peoples, because of course it was a collection of fragmented city-states back then. And I want you to remember that it's a song right from the very beginning, right? If we go to the song of Ilium, Ilium is the Latin name for Troy, right? This idea of the story of Troy, the Iliad, the war for, the Trojans the Greeks go to fight the Trojans to get back Helen, who was stolen by Paris from her spouse Menelaus, right? When Paris judged Aphrodite to be the most beautiful of all the goddesses. Talk about a tough situation, right? Paris is asked to say, who's more beautiful? Aphrodite, the god of love, Hera, the queen of all the gods, the wife of Zeus, or Athena, the great philosopher warrior. That's only going to end bad, because if you pick one, you're going to anger the other two, right? So when the Greeks go to reclaim Helen, this is the song of the war for Troy. And it ultimately becomes about Achilles and the wrath of Achilles. Achilles, in the beginning of the Iliad, feels that a wrong has been done to him, because the great general Agamemnon has stolen Achilles's war prize, Briseis, right? His you can think of her as his concubine, his slave girl. Now we find out later he has no feelings at all for Briseis. It's his honor that has been upset. So listen to how the Iliad begins. I want you to hear this song. All my references today will be to the superb translation of the Iliad by Robert Fagles, right? Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous doom that cost the Achaeans, that's the Trojans, countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, Lord of men, and the brilliant Achilles. I always tell my students, I want you to feel that electric charge that's running like a current through the Iliad from beginning to end. It has what is, in my mind, the greatest scene in the history of Western literature, which I'll talk to you about later. But right from the very beginning, this idea of sing to me, muse, of the wrath, the rage of Achilles. This is the whole essence of the Iliad. The Iliad is more remote than the Odyssey. Why? Well, the Iliad is about war. It's about honor. It's about men on the battlefield in dust and blood, trying to literally rip each other's guts out for prizes and trophies. And the Odyssey is much more relatable because it's about a guy returning home after 20 years. Odysseus has been at war for 10 years in the war against Troy, and another 10 years, the homecoming. So it's quite a remarkable, that of course many of us can relate to, the idea of homecoming. War is, of course, a much more specific character, and especially this quest for glory that is so built into the Iliad. But I want you to hear that song, that epic pitch right from the beginning. And you got to remember the facts of this war. Here you see Achilles on a Greek vase with Patroclus. It's never explicitly clear what his relationship to Patroclus is. It seems it's suggested, and it's quite palpable that they were lovers, right? This was very common in ancient Greece. The kind of the mentor figure and his younger lover, and it was bound by friendship that also had a physical component. So that's what the test is suggesting. And when you see Achilles' reaction to the death of Patroclus, you feel that whatever the relationship is, the bond between them is of the profoundest intimacy, right? Was it a real war? Was there really, a Trojan war? It's so hard to say. I mean, on the one hand, right, there was a Troy. Troy was a city, and it was destroyed, right? Archaeologists have excavated it. It may have very well been something resembling this Trojan War that the Iliad recounts. But of course, the Iliad is about gods, Achilles on the battlefield and the gods getting involved, whether it's Zeus or Athena or Aphrodite. And of course, that is the realm not of fact, not of history, but of mythology and religion. I mean, the Greeks wouldn't have called it. For them, it was religion. This is what they believed in, the way that we have, all these different traditions from the Judeo-Christian to the Islamic to Eastern religions, et cetera, et cetera. This was what they believed in. This was their version of the afterlife, right? So this war has a basis in fact, but it's really more about a kind of legend, right? Legend, these legendary figures. And the Greek historians, even astonishingly gifted Greek historians like Herodotus, many call him the first social historian because he wrote so much, not just about big public events, but about, people's lives, people's everyday customs and practices. This was part of the world of the Iliad, okay? So it comes down to Achilles is faced with this great choice, okay? Achilles' choice. His choice is, do I fight or do I not fight? He hates Agamemnon, his general, because Agamemnon, his general, has stolen his war prize, which to him is like stealing his honor. And listen to what he says to Agamemnon in book 1. Shameless, armored in shamelessness, always shrewd with greed. How could any Argive Greek soldier obey your orders freely and gladly, do your sailing for you or fight your enemies? No, not I. It wasn't Trojan spearmen who brought me here to fight. He's basically saying, I have no qualm with the Trojans. What do I have against them, right? It has nothing to do with them. I don't care about them. I came here to fight this war because of codes, honor, glory, and here we are. You steal my prize. Agamemnon's a very problematic figure. Of course, Agamemnon actually sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, when the gods sort of said, if you want to fare better in war, we require this sacrifice, basically to get better winds. His ships were stuck, and he will go home, Agamemnon, and be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, who will in turn be killed by her son Orestes in this terrible spiral of vengeance. But I see Agamemnon, to me, the genius of the Iliad is that Agamemnon becomes almost like this Hamlet-like figure. He's facing an existential crisis. Do I fight in a war I no longer believe in? Do I fight in a war I no longer believe in? This is the awful truth, the awful gory glory of the Iliad. And he will eventually fight, but the struggles that Agamemnon faces have a lot to do with a kind of sense that the war is meaningless. What am I really fighting for? He will fight when Patroclus is killed and he goes back into battle. And that's really the issue there. But until then, we don't have a sense that Achilles feels invested in the war. He's lost his faith in it. It's not just Agamemnon, not just Achilles and Agamemnon. There's other really great figures in the Iliad. There's Odysseus, right? You see him here with Penelope, and he becomes the hero of the second part of the epic cycle, the Odyssey. There's Ajax. There's all these great heroes. There's Hector, the Trojan hero, right? There's Andromache. So this is all happening in the Iliad. And what's brilliant about it is the way Homer weaves these parallel narratives, right? On the one hand, you have the Achilles' great struggle, right? And then you have also this, this other thing going on with all these side narratives. What's especially compelling, and here you see Andromache with the body of Hector, because Hector is killed in the war, and their child Astyanax. And, Andromache's plight is so heartbreaking because she basically knows that Hector's going to die in war. And so when he goes out to battle, this is what she says to him in book 6. Reckless one, my Hector, your own fiery courage will destroy you. Have you no pity for him, our helpless son, or me, and the destiny that weighs me down, your widow now so soon? Yes, they will kill you off, all the Achaean forces massed for assault, and then bereft of you, better for me to sink beneath the earth. What other warmth, what comforts left for me once you have met your doom? Nothing but torment. This is a brilliant scholar, Thomas Green, described Andromache's lament as the voice of epic's losers. We all know who the winners are, the Greeks, the Romans, all these, with the winners of these wars. But what about those who lose the epic? Andromache, after the war, goes from being once the glorious queen of Troy, princess, wife of Hector, to a slave who's actually forced to marry a relative of Achilles, right? The ultimate debasement. This is the tragedy of the struggles of war, in which Homer so brilliantly creates in these parallel narratives. The gods are so different from our we'll say, a major tradition in the West, the Judeo-Christian tradition. They're so different from this idea of a monotheistic, all-powerful God, right? Who's remote, right? These gods are very needy, right? Hera, the wife of Zeus, hates the Trojans with an implacable rage because, of course, Paris had done her ill by not judging her as beautiful as Aphrodite. Then there's the other gods who want to protect the Trojans. Then there's the gods who want to protect the Greeks. It's this sort of free-for-all on Mount Olympus. These gods are getting involved, they're mixing it up. In some cases, the gods have affairs with mortal men and women. I mean, why would you think, that these gods have everything, who are deathless? Maybe it has to do with the thrill of mortality, the electric charge that they feel in their encounters with mortal life. This is the great subplot, one of the many in the Iliad, right? And the Iliad follows the Aristotelian, this is a bust of Aristotle, the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action, okay? This is really a fascinating thing. Aristotle said a play should be about one main event, and this is all about the Trojan War, should take place in one circumscribed set of time, and it does. It's just one brief it's basically year 9 of the war against Troy. We don't get the earlier story, we don't get the destruction of Troy, we just get this sort of concentrated focus on this period that ends with the death of Hector and his burial, and the unities of time, place, and action. So it's a very taut, magnificently unified play, which will be the opposite of the Odyssey, as you'll see. And it's about these myths had all these different versions, right? There were many different versions circulating, and the Odyssey and the Iliad kind of become the de facto most prestigious source of all these competing myths. I told you about the contest between, that Paris judged Aphrodite to be the most beautiful because he promised, the hand of Helen to the winner. If he promised, Paris, Helen, if he would judge him, if he would judge her the most beautiful. So there's all this sort of mythological subtext. But ultimately, the book is about the wrath of Achilles. That's the unifying concept here. Achilles' anger, Achilles' struggle with this monumental decision that he has to make about to fight or not to fight. There's many beautiful passages along the way, right? There's the face that launched 1,000 ships, right? Helen, I think a scholar actually studied it, and it's like 1,168 ships, something like that. But that's not as poetic as 1,000 ships, is it, right? So the face that launched 1,000 ships, and you get the beautiful catalog of ships that Helen, this renowned beauty, made sail to win her back, the Greek fleet, right? The face that launched 1,000 ships. And I told you a little bit about Andromache's laments in books. You have them in book 6 and book 7, this idea that she knows she is going to lose everything. It's just in the air. And what will happen? And I think it's important that it's a woman who loses everything, because this is a very male world. The men get all the honor. The men get all the glory on the battlefield. And there's this sense of a kind of the marginalization of women in this epic world. There's also other passages that are famous, like the passage on Achilles' shield in book 18, where in depth there's this kind of careful depiction of every little, the stories and the honor on Achilles' shield. That the god Hephaestus forges under Mount Etna, for Achilles at his wife Aphrodite's behest. So there's all these wonderful moments, but it all culminates for me in what I feel is one of, if not the greatest, most dramatic scene in Western lit. First of all, you have to remember, this is total war. Book 21 describes, Athena's heart leapt high. She charged at Aphrodite, overtook her, and beat her breasts with clenched fists. Even the gods are fighting. I mean, like, think of this now. But now for total war, bearing down on the other gods, disastrous, massive, their fighting fury, blasting loose from opposing camps, the power collided. There's a real free-for-all, a melee on the battlefield, right? This is what's happening to the gods here, the gods and immortals. So what happens during this war, of course, is that, Achilles' best friend Patroclus steals his armor and makes a terrible decision to go into battle and fight Hector. Hector lays him low. He kills him. He slays him. Not surprising. And he even desecrates the corpse, which is a kind of foreshadowing what will happen to Hector, right? So there's this sense of this traumatic moment for Achilles. I believe Achilles suffers from PTSD, which we call now, and this is one of the ways the Iliad is so relevant. Soldiers coming back from war, not being able to cope with reality. Virginia Woolf writes about this, of the character Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway. There's this sense of not being able to handle we saw this so often, we see it today, we saw it in Vietnam, et cetera, soldiers traumatized by war psychologically. Look what happens to Achilles after his best friend dies, right? He's so haunted by the ghost of Patroclus. At one point, we read in book 23, and the swift runner Achilles assured Patroclus in his dream warmly, "Why have you returned to me here, dear brother friend? Why tell me of all that I must do? I do it all. I obey you. Oh, come closer. Throw our arms around each other just for a moment. Take some joy in the tears that numb the heart." This is the world of the Iliad. This great intimacy between Achilles and Patroclus, this love that they share. After he loses Patroclus, Achilles goes on a murderous rampage. He slays Hector in battle. And not only that, he desecrates his corpse. Listen to what he does, right? At last, he leaped to his feet. And the first thing he does in the morning, right? And he yoke his racing team. He'd lash the corpse of Hector behind the cart for dragging and haul him 3 times round the dead Patroclus's tomb. And there he'd rest in his tents and leave the body sprawled face down in the dust. This is how traumatized Achilles is. He's reduced to desecrating the corpse, a dishonorable act, according to the ethos of battle that they lived by. But he's lost his senses, you could say. So what happens? The father of Hector, Priam, who had 50 sons, many of whom were killed by Achilles and the Trojans, does something extraordinary. He journeys to the Greek camp and goes to find Achilles in his tomb to beg him to give him back the body of Hector so that they can give Hector a proper burial and that Hector can then go off to the underworld. Without that burial, his shade is in limbo, right? So this is what Priam does. The majestic king of Troy slipped past the rest and kneeling down beside Achilles, clasped his hands and kissed his hand, those terrible man-killing hands that had slaughtered Priam's many sons in battle. "Remember your own father, great God like Achilles, as old as I am," he says to him, right? And listen to what happens. "Pity me in my own right. I remember your father. I deserve more pity. I have endured what no one on earth has ever done before. I put my lips to the hands of the man who killed my son." Wow. I mean, this scene makes my hair stand on end. And then what happens afterwards? This is it's already so moving. But at that point, it's like Achilles, this act of moral genius, of his hand being kissed, of absolute forgiveness, of absolvement. It's like Achilles' trauma melts away and he remembers his own father. And he remembers this terrible war that they've been all fighting. And he embraces Priam. And they begin to wail together, these two hardened warriors. And as Homer writes, and their wailing and sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. The sheer agony of all they've endured. And Achilles agrees to give back the body of Hector. And this is how the Iliad ends, with this remarkable line. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. It's such a remarkable conclusion to the trauma of Achilles, right? This kissing of the hand. And it's this incredible segue to a very different book. This is book 24 of the Iliad. The Odyssey is very different. I call it the modern Homer, right? The Iliad seems to take place in this time of warfare, this time of battle, this time of struggle, right? Not so the Odyssey. The Odyssey, on the other hand, as I said, in the beginning of the Odyssey, we don't even see Odysseus. We just see his son Telemachus and his wife Penelope waiting for him. This isn't the war. This is the post-war. You see what I mean? The Iliad is the war. This is the post-war. This is the return to Ithaca, right? This sort of place in the periphery. Even Odysseus describes it as this kind of, this rocky place that is home for him, but not the most beautiful or fertile part of the Greek lands, right? Rocky, jagged, rugged. It's about the return home. And it's almost like the Trojan War retirees we meet in this book, right? We meet Agamemnon, we meet Menelaus. We can't meet Agamemnon, of course, because he's been killed. But we meet Menelaus with his wife, Helen. They host Telemachus on his journey to find Odysseus early in the book. Later, we actually meet Achilles in the underworld, a remarkable scene in book 11, when Achilles basically says, I would rather be a slave for a moment on earth than the king of the underworld for all eternity. It's an amazing line. He says to him, let me hear no smooth talk from you, Odysseus, light of counsels. Better, I say, and I'm reading, all my quotes are from the Fitzgerald, magnificent translation of the Odyssey. Better, I say, to break sod as a farmhand for some poor countryman on iron rations than to lord it over all the exhausted dead, right? I'd rather, and this is about the Greek worldview, right? Part of the cycle is very relevant today. Part of it less so. Part of that's less relevant is this sense that the Greeks had very little interest in the afterlife. They didn't really have a Christian heaven, right? They had the afterworld, the underworld, you can call it what you will, and heroes did get the kind of royal treatment there, but it wasn't like the heaven where your soul was in bliss forever. What they loved was earthly life. So the retirees of this war are kind of melancholic, dislocated, at a loss after their glory days, right? And it's not unified at all. The Iliad was tightly wound, one unity of time, place, and action, according to Aristotle. The Odyssey is sprawling. It's like Hamlet. It's all over the map, right? It starts in Odysseus's Ithaca without Odysseus. Then we follow Odysseus's wanderings trying to get home. We follow his story of how he, outwitted the Cyclops, how he left Calliope. I'm sorry, not Calliope, how he left Calypso on her island, how he finally got back to the suitors. It's all over the map. It's very disunified. This is why one of the reasons why some people believe they weren't written by the same person, right? So it's about the same legends as the Iliad, but they're receding. They're receding. Here you see Herodotus, right? The writer of the Greek legend. The world of the Odyssey is a belated world. It's as though all the firepower, all the brilliance, all the glory of the earlier Iliad is somehow gone, right? There's this amazing moment where, when Odysseus and Telemachus are finally reunited, Telemachus is like, how are we going to defeat the suitors? And Odysseus is like, well, how many of them are there? And Telemachus is like, well, 58. And Odysseus is like, okay, let's take them on. Like, he's an epic hero. He had fought with Achilles, no big deal. And Telemachus is like, Dad, there's 58 of them and 2 of us. That's not how it works. They'll overpower us, but it's like they come from different worlds. Odysseus comes from the epic past, and his son inhabits this belated modern world where such acts of heroism aren't possible, right? In this, we go from strife on Olympus in the Iliad, and also in the Odyssey, the gods are involved, but it's more the Odyssey's about tedium at home. Penelope struggling. It's a very domestic book. Penelope struggling to fend off the suitors, weaving this cloth every day, and at night dismantling it, and these 50 plus suitors vying for her hand, eating her food, sleeping with her slave girls, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot of, and this is what happens when Odysseus comes home. He finds nothing but problems after his 20-year disappointment. A lot of it is about local strife. It reminds me what they said about Churchill. They say Churchill was a great wartime prime minister and not a good peacetime one. After the war, you needed a different kind of figure, more of an administrator than a general, right? And it's sort of what happens. The Iliad is war, is about battle, generals and soldiers. The Odyssey is about local politics, intrigue, gossip, and this domestic sphere that's quite different from the Iliad. So the myths are still there, but they're more muted. It's more not mythical, but more mundane, more about the everyday, right? So right from the beginning, this muted song takes the form of an absent hero. Where is Odysseus? He doesn't show up. The beginning of the Odyssey is famous. Sing in me, muse. It still has that song, right? Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending. The wanderer harried for years on end after he plundered the stronghold on the proud height of Troy, right? Sing in me, muse. This is very different from the Iliad because Achilles is front and center in book 1 of the Iliad. Where's Odysseus in the first few books of the Odyssey? Nowhere to be found. He's on Calypso's island, right? He's basically her prisoner in her cave. He has to sort of, live with her and, be her lover. When you see him, what he wants is Ithaca. See where he's looking? He's looking, weeping to Ithaca on the shore, looking home. So he's an absent hero. And, the great classic scholar, Mary Beard, says, this is such a patriarchal text, right? Penelope is so confident. She's like the female version of Odysseus in her cunning and her craftiness. But yet Telemachus has to prove he's just as great as his dad and wants to kind of show that at every turn. So in the beginning, when Penelope tries to get involved, he's like, Mother, why do you grudge our own dear minstrel joy of song wherever his thoughts may lead, right? He's basically saying to her, Mom, stay back, be quiet, let me handle this, right? So Mary Beard writes that basically Western literature begins with this patriarchal image of a boy telling his mom to recede into the background and be quiet, let him handle it, right? It's this idea of male, it's this toxic male display. Well, however you want to interpret it, Odysseus is not here. And the son is really the focus of these early stories. And the son doesn't know the father, doesn't know. He's the heir apparent, Telemachus, but he really only, when he meets Odysseus, he basically says, I only know you through through your famous stories. I don't know you otherwise. And there's some magnificent, we see Helen in book 4, right? She resurfaces that face that launched 1,000 plus ships. And Helen came out of her scented chamber, a moving grace like Artemis, straight as a shaft of gold, right? Beautiful description. Where's Odysseus during all this? He's on Calypso's island, and he's known for his cunning, for his gift with words. And when Hermes shows up, the Greek messenger god, when the Greek messenger god shows up, it's always trouble, right? I always joke with my students. It's like, it's like if Hermes shows up with a package dressed up as the UPS delivery man or as a mailman, don't open the door because it's only trouble, right? He's coming to claim Odysseus and take him off the island, right? So Calypso, who you see here, who's a goddess, says, you gods are so jealous when we finally find love with mortals. And Odysseus has to get himself out of it. And he uses his verbal skill. He says, my lady goddess, this is no cause for anger. My quiet Penelope, how well I know, would seem a shade before your majesty, death and old age being unknown to you, right? While she must die. He's basically saying Penelope is nothing compared to you. She's just this, my shy, retiring wife, and you're this lustrous goddess. And it almost makes it impossible for Calypso to be angry at him, right? So she sends him on his way. She gives him her blessing, and he starts this circuitous journey home. Now, the amazing thing about all the famous adventures that he has, they're not narrated in real time. They're told as stories after Odysseus lands. First, one of his famous landing is in Sicily, in the island of Nausicaa, right? This beautiful princess. He goes to her father's court and tells the story. He starts to narrate all these adventures, starting on Nausicaa's island. And there he also narrates the story of the Trojan horse. So notice how all this is happening as a story. I think the relevance, the greatest relevance of the Odyssey is that it's about the power of storytelling. It is itself a story, right? Walter Benjamin, the great German critic, talked about the difference between the novelist and the storyteller. The novelist writes in silence, sends his story to an anonymous readership, and tries to kind of connects with readers invisibly. But the storyteller is among the people. It's like you're at a fireside chat, narrating the story, right? Interacting with the people. You see the gestures, just like you see mine. You hear the voice, right? This is how an Odysseus, he's a storyteller. This book is so much about storytelling. And there's this sense of in the Odyssey, this idea of how not to lead. Odysseus is a great leader. Agamemnon was self-serving, boastful. He was someone who was, all about himself. And that's why Achilles didn't want to fight for him, not Odysseus. When Odysseus introduces himself, he's always part of a larger group. We hear of, I am Laertes' son, Odysseus. Men hold me formidable for guile and peace and war. My home is on the peaked sea mark of Ithaca, right? And he tells about being with Calypso, but he says, oh, in my heart, I never gave consent. He's always looking out for his men. He's always identifying himself as a son, a husband, right? A father, never as an individual, never as an individual. And this is why I always say Odysseus would make a great CEO. He has all these great leadership qualities that Agamemnon lacks, right? We meet Achilles in book 11. I narrated that scene to you where he basically says, I'd rather be a slave for a moment in earth than king of the underworld, right? And then we know Odysseus is struggling to get home because of the curses. He's made some very powerful enemies. One of his enemies is Poseidon. And if you're on a boat at sea, you don't want to make Poseidon, Lord of the Trident, your enemy because of what he did to Poseidon's son, the Cyclops, where he put out his eye and couldn't resist saying, Odysseus, son of Laertes, was the cause of your demise because the Cyclops had murdered and eaten Odysseus's men. And we know Odysseus is all about experience of the world. He hears the siren song. He has himself lashed to the mast, but he wants to hear their beautiful song because he's such an intellectually curious person. And he's an adventurer, right? There's so many great adventures. I remember I first read the Odyssey as a kid, the adventure part, right? But the book is about so much more, so much more. It's about hospitality. Odysseus comes back to ancient Greece. to his home of Ithaca dressed as a beggar. And this was very important to the ancient Greeks because you never knew who was dressed up, right, in these shabby clothes. It could be a god. So you had to honor people, give them hospitality, right? But there's also a dark side. Beyond Odysseus' nostalgia for his homeland, there's also a lot, and beyond his sort of love for Telemachus, there's also a kind of cruelty in the Odyssey, right? First of all, Margaret Atwood, who wrote the story of women in the Odyssey, the Penelopiad, which is a fascinating book about the fate of women, right? The suitors violate the law of hospitality. They eat Odysseus's food. They cavort with Penelope's women, et cetera, and they meet a gruesome end, right? After Odysseus is recognized, when his nurse sees the scar on when she's bathing him, right? He's undercover. This great German scholar, Erich Auerbach, said that this is the beginning of realism in literature. When you see the careful description of Odysseus's scar, right? This is so different than the Bible with its language of, these and thous, and its more prophetic language. The Odyssey, according to the great scholar Auerbach, is the beginning of realist prose, details, fact, not fact so much because it's myth, but details, episodes, storytelling, right? And what happens is Odysseus and Telemachus show, in King Lear, he wants proof, right? Lear wants proof of Desdemona's infidelity, right? Ocular proof. The scar becomes sort of ocular proof that this is the real Odysseus. But then he strings his bow in the hall. And what does he do with it? He slaughters all of the suitors, right? Kills them all. It's a bloodbath. It's gory. Slaughter in the great hall. But then the slaughter includes, to me, one of the most gruesome episodes of all the Odyssey. All of Penelope's women are hanged in the great hall, right? They're hanged in the great hall. It's this really remarkable scene. When the great room is cleaned up at sword point, they force the woman out. And Telemachus said, I would not give the clean death of a beast to trolls who made a mockery of my mother and of me too, you. And then he calls them this disparaging word. You who lay with the suitors. He tied one end of the hawser to a pillar and passed them through. They would be hung like doves or larks and springes triggered in a thicket where the birds think to nest, a cruel nesting. So now in turn, each woman thrust her head into a noose and swung, yanked high in the air, to perish there most piteously. Their feet danced for a little, but not for long. So there's these elements of cruelty in the Odyssey that are sort of overwhelming, right? It's a world filled with riddles. Penelope, when Odysseus returns, Penelope quizzes him on their bed, which was made basically of an oak tree that was planted in the room, and he passes the test, right? So they're finally reunited. And how do they spend their first night? Telling stories to one another. Again, such a different conclusion. The Iliad ends with this horror, with this closure of the burial of Hector. We don't get any closure at the end of the Odyssey, right? There's a war. The suitors' families come and want to make Odysseus pay for killing them, and Athena shows up, right? And this is the ending of the Odyssey, right? Now hold, Athena cried, break off this bitter skirmish. And then the soldiers see her, their face paled with dread, their swords drop to the ground. With a cry to freeze their hearts and ruffling like an eagle on the pouls, the Lord Odysseus reared himself to follow. We don't feel that closure, right? We don't feel that same sense the way the Iliad ends. The Iliad ends, and so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. Why don't we feel that closure? Because to me, the Odyssey is more modern. It's about the sort of the passing of that world of heroes and codes of glory and dealing with more modern issues, political strife, infighting, squabbling, et cetera, et cetera. And I think in a way its relatability is why it's had more of an afterlife than the Iliad has. Here's some examples of it. Dante in Inferno 26 has a famous scene where Odysseus, and he uses the Latin title, the Latin name Ulysses, speaks to his men and says, consider your seed. You are not to made to live like brutes, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. Odysseus/Ulysses becomes a symbol of intellectual questing, right? And similarly, in Frankenstein, when Victor Frankenstein, after he's created the monster and is pursuing him, basically recapitulates Dante's speech via the figure of Ulysses, and have Victor Frankenstein say, "Oh, be men, be more than men, be hailed as benefactors by your species, pursue knowledge." Ulysses/Odysseus as the symbol of pursuit of knowledge. And most astonishingly of all, Primo Levi, in his moving book, Survival at Auschwitz, when the autobiographical protagonist, Primo Levi himself, has reached really the ground zero of life, the ultimate despair, he remembers in one of his darkest moments, Il canto di Ulisse, the song of Ulysses and Dante, and that line, remember your origins. You were meant to not to live as brutes, but to pursue virtue and knowledge. And through this line, Levi feels human and is reminded that it's his captors, his Nazi captors, who are the brutes, who are acting animalistic, and that he has a core of humanity that he must protect and that will help him survive. All these are examples of this astonishing afterlife of the Iliad and the Odyssey. If Achilles is bent on glory, the quest for the absolute, the quest for immortality on the battlefield, Odysseus is bent on story. He's the storyteller. This is how he ends his days with Penelope. And I think for all the horror of the Iliad and all the horror of the Odyssey, it ends with this beautiful image of Odysseus and Penelope together. And as the Latin phrase says, amor vincit omnia, love conquers all. Thank you so much for this chance to share these thoughts and ideas on Homer and his afterlife and his legacy today. And I look forward very much to our conversation and your questions. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation and questions period. I'm so looking forward to digging in and seeing what you had to say, your comments and thoughts, and above all, your questions about the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer's legacy today. Already, I see many questions have come into the chat, and I'll get right to them. If for some reason you do send me a question and I'm not able to get to it, it's only because there was just too many questions in too short a time. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time. You can always reach me through my website at www.josephlutzi.com. I'm always happy to hear from you. So the first question was, is there a particular translation that I would recommend? Now, that's a very difficult question. Unless we're reading the Iliad and the Odyssey in the ancient Greek, which, probably, 0.001% of all readers of these texts can do that. We're all reading it in translation. And now, this is how I approach that issue. So a lot of it just has to do with the translation that right? For example, when I discuss the Iliad, I use Robert Fagles' translation. He's a very distinguished translator of Homer and of Virgil, and he writes in a very kind of elegant and accessible language. So, that's just the Iliad, the version of the Iliad that I had read, that I was familiar with, that I've taught. Similarly, with the Odyssey, I've been very familiar, and I've taught Robert Fitzgerald's version, which is quite different than the Fagles. The Fagles is more kind of a modernizing of Homer, whereas the Fitzgerald uses the archaic names, the archaic spelling of the characters. It has much more of an ancient feel to it. They both work. I mean, the beauty of Homer is that there are some magnificent translations out there, right? For example, you could, Alexander Pope, the great British poet from the 18th century, was a translator. There's a very, very long list of accomplished versions of it, and the lists go on to the present. So I would say, trust your instincts. Don't feel that you have to be pigeonholed to any one translation. And if you do, if you are approaching Homer and reading him, that you can avail yourselves of a wide array of wonderful versions of it. And I mentioned the two that I am most familiar with. And I'm not going to say that they're best, they're just the ones that I happen to have read and taught the most. So that would be my answer to that question, which is really an important one, because translation means to carry over, right? And when I read to you the English of Robert Fagles and the English of Robert Fitzgerald, what they're doing is translating, carrying across Homer from his ancient context into our modern. Have there been any movies of the Iliad and Odyssey that are reasonably faithful to the book? There's been a lot of them. Italy had a genre called the peplum films, which is really translates into like sword and sandal, right? Guys dressed up in ancient garb, sword and sandals everywhere. And this was like a genre in Italy, and a lot of these films were about the epics in Italy. But in every tradition, maybe some of you have seen Troy, starring, Brad Pitt as Achilles and Eric Bana as Hector. That was one that was really out and got a lot of viewers. What can I say? I'm not. I'll leave it to my colleagues in film to talk about the qualities or lack thereof of the adaptations of Homer for the screen. What I would say is this: to get the real flavor of the epics, I would read them, right? Because this is the original story. And not only read them, but another way to go about it is you might want to listen to them, like via Audible, because remember, or any other, audio platform, because these books were originally narrated orally. That was how they were first consumed. So when they weren't read in silence, you heard the story. So more than the screen, more than the image, what I would recommend is the reading experience, because you're getting the language and the story unmediated, but also the listening experience, to hear it expressed in language, One of you asked, that the effects of endless war. I mentioned total war in the Iliad, where even the goddesses, Aphrodite and was fighting fighting with Athena. Well, this is total war, and one of you put it very beautifully: the nature of honor and the costs of ambition, the claims of fame, and the idea of home itself. How do I see this in relation to sort of, a contemporary crisis like Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine? Is this a czarist fantasy or a Greek tragedy? Well, the scope of my talk isn't to comment on contemporary politics, but I will say this. The Greeks and the Trojans in the Trojan War, very much like what's happening in Ukraine today, one was fighting a war of aggression and one was fighting a war of defense, right? Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and essentially Troy is besieged by Greeks. So the Trojans are fighting for their lives to defend their city. The Greeks are raiding the city, trying to get Helen back, right? So they're the aggressors in this, in response to Paris's theft, abduction of Helen. But what comes across, especially in the Iliad, and to a less extent in the Odyssey, because Odysseus is in his own way is trying to reclaim his homeland Ithaca and wrest it from the grip of the suitors. But in the Iliad, it's clear that if someone like Hector, the Trojan, is fighting to defend his homeland from invaders. So it's not the Iliad isn't as political as, say, the Aeneid, right? Which is about the rise of Rome and the whole ideology of Rome's imperial mission. You don't feel that when you read the Iliad, right? You don't feel the presence of this political ideology, right? It's more about battle and the quest for glory and the human issues surrounding it. But one thing is clear, right? The invasion of Troy and what it required men like Hector to do was essentially lay down their lives in defense of their homeland, right? At one point, Paris flees the battlefield to basically go make love with Helen, while he's supposed to be fighting. And, his brother Hector says to him, how can you do this? I'm paraphrasing me saying, we're fighting a war, right? Our cities, our civilization's at stake. And what will happen is the Greeks will destroy, in Homer's narrative, the entire city of Troy. So it is truly a battle of life or death for the Trojans. The Greeks are fighting for their lives, but they are the aggressors here. And Homer constructs his narrative so that we're aware that what someone like Hector is doing is making the ultimate sacrifice for his homeland and its defense. So excellent question. One of you asked, did these stories follow, is it mostly a Western phenomenon, or did they spread eastward? Look, at this point, the Iliad and the Odyssey they're world famous, right? They're part of world literature. Every literary culture and has heard, in some way has heard of Homer, has heard of the exploits of Odysseus. Not, maybe not everyone, but let's say it's definitely a global phenomenon, right? But I still think it's predominantly a Western cultural matrix, in the sense that I like to think of the Iliad and the Odyssey as a kind of a starting point for Western literature. Not the only one. There were others, right? There were other tributaries, but we'll call it the river, right? The surging flow of literary history really begins with these epics. Why? For three reasons. One, the epic of all the literary forms, the lyric poem, the novel, drama, the epic is by far the most prestigious. If you wanted to make your name as a writer, you wrote an epic. That's why Dante wrote an epic. That's why Milton writes an epic. That's why Virgil writes an epic. That was where you showed you could do battle with the greatest literary minds in history, right? Writing in epics. So the epic has this prestige for centuries. People don't write them now. Now maybe a novel will be called epic, but it's not the same thing. Epic poetry had its rules. It was the most prestigious genre. Two, the Greek epic becomes the source for, when Virgil writes his Aeneid, right, in 19 BC, he models the first 6 books on the Odyssey and the last 6 books on the Iliad, right? So he's directly alluding to Homer. And when, of course, Dante, all the other epic poets that follow are so aware of this great source in Homer's epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the third thing is, beyond the first two I mentioned, the first is the prestige of the epic. The second is the model of the Homeric epic itself, which influences later one. The third one is that this book remains so relevant. Of course, we can relate, unfortunately, to war, right? Of course, we can relate, unfortunately, to the loss of homeland, right? I've created a virtual book club which brings together readers from throughout the world. We're in many different countries, hundreds of members throughout the United States and globally. And one of the things that always amazes me in choosing the works that we read contemporary classics, we read contemporary bestsellers, we also read beloved classics. So many of them are in debt to Homer, right? The Iliad, the Odyssey. One of our books was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? Which is one of the oldest books that we chose. But even that one, I remember that scene I described when Victor Frankenstein is trying to convince his men to go forward, right? And he quotes basically Dante's quotation of the figure of Ulysses slash Odysseus as the great quester. So I just bring this up to tell you that the DNA of Western literature is so steeped, is so inflected by Homer that's it impossible to turn anywhere. Even in contemporary literature, there are so many echoes, there are so many shadows and so many refractions of the Homeric source. So I think of Homer as there was this wonderful quote by the Italian director Federico Fellini, who said of Roberto Rossellini, this pioneering director, he was the father of us all. You wouldn't have had Fellini and these great directors without Rossellini and his neorealist classics. Similarly, so many writers in the Western tradition can say that Homer was the father of them all. And I think that is the perfect place for us to end this conversation on all the ways in which the Iliad and the Odyssey continue to inform our lives today. Thank you so much, and I look forward to our next conversations.